Mr. Stephen Olson, thanks very much for joining our interview today.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
So the first question for you is, what is the root cause for a U.S.-China trade war? Is it just really about trade?
Sure. Well, on the surface level, it would appear that the U.S. and China are in dispute over issues like technology policies, subsidies, intellectual property, etc. But these are really just symptoms or manifestations of a larger underlying systemic challenge, which is how do you reconcile two fundamentally different economic systems under the framework of a single set of global trade rules? So for instance, in the case of the United States, you've got a market-driven economy, traditionally at least pursuing free trade policies. And in the case of China, you've got a centrally managed economy pursuing state-directed capitalism and quasi-mercantilist trade policies. And almost all of the frictions that we see playing out now between the United States and China are a result of these two different systems now increasingly bumping up against each other as the size and sophistication of China's economy continues to grow. And we've seen that, unfortunately, the rules of global trade are almost entirely incapable of resolving and adjudicating these points of friction between these different systems. Keep in mind that our existing trade system was established in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and was based almost entirely on U.S. economic philosophies. Free markets, free trade, and government staying largely out of business. Now, in the early decades, no one could have possibly imagined China's economic rise. And in the later decades, when China's economic rise became more evident, the assumption was that China was going to inevitably gravitate towards Western economic models. Of course, today, those illusions are gone. It's understood China will continue to be China. Now, I don't really see any point in getting into a debate over which system is better, worse, good, or bad. The reality is we've got both of these systems. They have to be reconciled under a single set of global trading rules, and that's really the root cause of the current U.S.-China trade war.
Thank you. So the second question is the partial trade deal really a win-win for U.S.-China, or this rivalry will last as a geopolitical competition?
Sure. Well, first, let's be clear about the process. In early October, the U.S. and China announced a quote-unquote agreement in principle on an interim Phase 1 trade deal. Now, what that basically means is that the U.S. and China had reached agreement on the main points, but all the details remain to be worked out. Now, in the weeks after that, it became evident that perhaps these two countries were further apart in their positions than was initially presented. And so originally it was anticipated that this interim trade deal would be completed by mid-November. Now, needless to say, that deadline has slipped. I do think we can consider an interim trade agreement to be a positive step, but only a very modest positive step. The issues that the Phase 1 trade agreement will cover are, relatively speaking, comparatively speaking, the easier and the more simple issues. The more difficult issues are being deferred until the subsequent rounds of negotiation. So Phase 1 trade agreement, certainly better than a breakdown in negotiations, certainly better than a further escalation in tariffs, but as I said, we do have to consider it to be a positive but modest positive step.
Come to the third question.
Sure.
Will WTO and other financial institutions need to revolve for new economic reality? And do you think that it has been failing in the wake of recent global trade dysfunction?
We're currently witnessing the most significant trade war in 80 or 90 years between the two largest economies in the world, the two largest trading nations in the world, and the World Trade Organization, which is supposed to, in essence, function as a global trade referee, has been largely on the sidelines. So I don't think there's any question that the WTO needs to be reformed. Certainly it needs to work out new protocols, new rules to do a better job in managing these points of friction between different economic systems. But there are also what I would refer to as sort of operational challenges facing the WTO, which really call into question the ability of the organization to execute its most basic functions, its most basic responsibilities. So, for example, there's been a long simmering dispute over the appointment of appellate body judges. Now, I understand this is an issue that most people aren't familiar with, so I'll take just a brief minute to explain the background. Under WTO rules, if two members have a disagreement, they're able to bring that disagreement to a WTO dispute settlement panel. Then if one of the countries does not agree with the decision of the panel, they can refer that to an appellate body. They can appeal that decision to the appellate body. Now, the United States has had long-standing complaints that the appellate body judges have been guilty of judicial overreach, and for that reason, the U.S. has been blocking the appointment or the reappointment of appellate body judges. If that continues, it looks like the appellate body will no longer have the minimum level of judges necessary to continue to function. So needless to say, that's a serious issue. More broadly speaking, perhaps the most fundamental purpose of the WTO is to provide a platform or to provide a vehicle for conducting multilateral trade negotiations. And in fact, the WTO predecessor organization, the GATT, was able to conclude 8 multilateral rounds of negotiations from the late 40s to the early 1990s. Unfortunately, the WTO, in the roughly 25 years it's been in existence, has not been able to conclude a single round of these multilateral trade negotiations, calling many to question if we'll ever see another comprehensive multilateral round successfully concluded. So countries, WTO members, are certainly working hard to address some of these shortcomings, to reform the WTO, but from my point of view, it remains to be seen if these efforts will prove ultimately to be successful.
Is the U.S. losing its de facto leader in global trade after tit for tat with not only China, but its traditional allies like the EU?
Actually, I'm not sure losing is the correct word to use. I think it might be more accurate to say that the United States is abdicating or sort of deliberately stepping back from its traditional role as global leader. The Trump administration is literally the first U.S. administration in post-war history to very actively and fundamentally question the extent to which the United States benefits from a rules-based multilateral trade system. So the U.S. has not only been withdrawing its leadership, it's also been conducting itself in a number of ways. For instance, the application of unilateral punitive tariffs in such a way that potentially at least threatens the stability of the system. Now, of course, this is a reason for concern, but it does raise an interesting and a difficult question. If the existing structure of rules are no longer capable of addressing glaring and pressing problems, is the United States, or any other country for that matter, justified in taking actions outside of that system? Now, I don't say any of this to offer a defense of anything that the United States has done, but rather just to point out that there might be another side to the coin that we need to consider here.
Can protectionism be seen as a growing trend in the years to come?
Unfortunately, the answer is yes. I do think we can expect to see protectionism growing in the years to come. And I think this is largely a result of a backlash against international trade that we're seeing in a number of countries around the world. Correctly or sometimes incorrectly, a number of negative outcomes, negative economic outcomes, social outcomes, environmental outcomes are being attributed to international trade. Now, the best way to address this will be for businesses and governments to work together to ensure that trade is conducted on a more sustainable basis. We all recognize, of course, that trade is an essential ingredient in economic development, but it cannot be pursued sustainably unless there is an equivalent commitment to strengthening social capital and providing adequate environmental protection. The backlash against trade that we're witnessing, the protectionism that we're witnessing, suggests that we probably have not done a good enough job in balancing the economic, social, and environmental aspects of trade. So, for example, in wealthy developed countries like the United States, we see middle-class workers facing stagnant wages for a decade, if not more, and rising levels of income inequality. In less developed countries, people are noting that trade and foreign direct investment is sometimes accompanied by environmental degradation. So if we're serious about addressing protectionism and the backlash against trade, I think by definition we've got to be serious about having business and governments work together to make trade more sustainable. As a side note, I'd mention this is an area where my organization, the Hinrich Foundation, has done a lot of good work, in particular with our Sustainable Trade Index, and I'd encourage everybody to take a look at that.
What are other threats to global trade, and could you please comment on the prospects of global trade in 2020?
Well, I don't think there's any question that, as we've discussed, the U.S.-China trade war, WTO reform are going to continue to be important issues, but certainly not the only issues, not the only important issues. For instance, the very nature of trade itself is undergoing a dramatic transformation. Traditionally, when we talk about trade, we've been referring to trade in goods, machinery, clothing, agricultural products. But today when we talk about trade, we're increasingly talking about services, and we're talking about digital trade. So, for instance, the McKinsey Global Institute estimates that cross-border data flows now make a greater contribution to global GDP growth than trade in goods. But unfortunately, the rules of international trade have not kept pace with these new realities. So, for instance, if your export is a physical product, let's say office furniture, then the rules of international trade are entirely clear and entirely effective. But what happens if your export, instead of office furniture, is Netflix? Or what if your export is Google? Or what if your export is Facebook? Then the rules become a lot more ambiguous. So one of the big challenges we need to keep our eyes on, the need to craft trade rules which reflect the way business, technology, and trade are being conducted in the 21st century rather than the 20th century.
Thanks very much. I think that's it.
Sure, my pleasure.
Thanks again for joining the interview today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.